Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Perez. On the show tonight.
They lynch us in broad daylight with cameras rolling for...
Activists protest killings of black people at the hands of police, and Chicago braces for the release of a video showing an officer killing Adam Toledo.
This is a really rare event if you look at what we know so far.
A major setback in the COVID vaccine effort as the FDA calls for a pause in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. An infectious disease doctor weighs in.
Could the Supreme Court add more seats? A commission is set to examine just that, whether justices should have term limits, and more.
The Justice Department joins a lawsuit to get Chicago to install pedestrian signals for people who are blind or visually impaired.
We're fighting for treatment, not trauma.
Some organizations are calling for the city to reopen mental health clinics that closed 9 years ago. We hear from two sides.
Alderman Carrie Austin's fine for violating campaign finance rules drops by thousands of dollars. Why the ethics board made that decision.
Canceling student loan debt. Will President Joe Biden make it happen, and if so, by how much?
They'll be able to open up the bottle and smell home.
And a local company that's kept the Sazon in Chicago for over 60 years. But first, some of today's top stories. City and state officials say they're working to make arrangements for residents scheduled to receive the Johnson & Johnson vaccine now that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has recommended pausing the use of the single-dose vaccine.
It will have an impact, probably not as large an impact as it might have, simply because we had already seen a slowdown in the amount of Johnson & Johnson we were receiving because of some of the manufacturing problems.
Dr. Arwady says the mass vaccination site at Chicago State University is switching over to the Pfizer vaccine as of tomorrow, and the city is working to reach others who'd made appointments for the J&J vaccine, including the Protect Chicago Homebound program. And coming up shortly, Perez has much more on the effects of this vaccine being taken out of the rotation. State health officials say nearly 3,200 people have been newly diagnosed with the coronavirus and 17 people have died. More than 1.285 million people have tested positive since the pandemic began, and 21,540 people have died. Just over 23% of the state's population has been vaccinated. In Minneapolis, the prosecution rested its case against former police officer Derek Chauvin today as his attorneys began presenting their defense strategy, starting with a use of force expert who testified that Chauvin was justified in pinning George Floyd to the ground because he kept struggling.
Could you summarize the final opinions that you have made in this case?
I felt that Officer Chauvin's interactions with Mr. Floyd were following his training, following current practices in policing, and were objectively reasonable.
Barry Broad also testified that bystanders yelling at officers to get off of Floyd complicated the situation for Chauvin, causing him and other officers to wonder if the crowd was becoming a threat also. Meanwhile, the family of George Floyd today met with the family of 20-year-old Dante Wright, another man also killed by police, this time in Brooklyn Center, 12 miles away just 2 days ago. Here's George Floyd's brother, Philanice Floyd.
From the Floyd family, y'all have our condolences. We will stand in support with you all.
Meanwhile, the white Brooklyn Center police officer who fatally shot Wright, seen here, resigned today, as did the police chief. Former Chief Tim Gannon has said that 26-year veteran Kim Potter mistakenly grabbed her gun when she meant to grab her taser during a traffic stop on Sunday. It's been 2 weeks since 13-year-old Adam Toledo was shot dead by a Chicago police officer. Still no video of that incident has been made public. Amanda Vinicky joins us now live from Westtown with the latest on this story. Amanda.
Yeah, Brandis, I'm outside COPA, that is the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. COPA has said that it will release the body camera footage of that foot pursuit that occurred in the wee hours of March 29th that did lead to the death of 13-year-old Adam Toledo. but only making that footage public after Toledo's family has had the opportunity to view it. And we do believe that that time is now. It's been reported by media outlets, including WGN. You can't see, but just to my right, you have a bunch of TV cameras, journalists actually staked out on both sides of COPA headquarters, waiting to potentially hear from the family. Toledo's funeral was held on Friday. Now, that was private, but neighbors, friends, and supporters had held a vigil for Toledo earlier this month. We did learn some of what the family will reportedly be seeing in that footage during a bail hearing held a few days ago for the 21-year-old man who was with Toledo at the time and who supposedly fired the shots from the gun that called police to the scene. That was when we heard about that from Cook County prosecutors as they laid out their case during that bail hearing for what happened. Reportedly, however, Toledo was holding a gun when a police officer shot him in the chest. Now, there is no word from COPA on when, after the family's viewing, the video will be made public. I did reach out to COPA's spokesperson and no word back, nothing in the past couple of hours either from the attorneys for the Toledo family. But Chicago is prepared for public outcry once that footage is out, with the CPD tweeting on Monday evening that the department has increased its operational posture to ensure that everything is as safe as possible for residents. The Chicago Police Department is closely monitoring the events across the country. While there is no actionable intelligence at this time, out of an abundance of caution, CPD will be deploying additional resources across communities citywide, neighborhood retail corridors, and the downtown business district to ensure public safety in all areas of the city. And to supplement district personnel and resources, days off have been canceled for many teams and officers of the CPD. So again, that is a lot of preparation given all of the looting, protests, the rioting that occurred last summer in the wake of George Floyd's killing. But we did see some protests already in Chicago today. One was held in downtown near the Cloud Gate, or people perhaps know it better as the Bean, and that was a protest held seeking justice for Daunte Wright. That, of course, Brandis, as you just referenced there a minute ago, a man killed during a traffic stop in a suburb of Minneapolis, really nearby, actually, where George Floyd had been killed. Wright shot by a police officer who, in the video, had warned she was going to tase him, instead pulling out a gun and killing him. Now, the signs of protesters there at the Bean held up against police brutality, saying, "It's not an accident, it is murder," seeking justice for Daunte Wright. Activist Eric Russell says that these police killings of black people are modern-day lynchings.
The Klan used to take us out into the backwoods by torchlight, wearing hoods and sheets. But now the Klan, the prevailing opinion is that the Klan has turned in their white sheets for blue uniforms, and now they carry guns and badges, and they lynch us in broad daylight with cameras rolling for the world to see.
Russell also having no patience for the Lightfoot administration, saying that Mayor Lori Lightfoot is a police apologist.
Lori Lightfoot refuses to acknowledge, compensate, and remedy the black families and brown families here in Chicago. Chicago has some George Floyds. Chicago has some Breonna Taylors. But what about those families? And the mayor has been remiss in her commitment to real police reform.
Now, again, that protest was modest. I'd say about 100 people, give or take. And after the Bean, they began a march down Michigan Avenue, and they were planning to go to the Gold Coast. But Russell says that activists are preparing for more action, and we will continue to be here waiting outside COPA to hear if the Toledo family is going to speak at all, share with media and reporters the has to be very difficult viewing experience that they will have just had. With that, back to you.
Yes, Amanda, a case that a lot of people are watching in Chicago this week, of course. Thank you. And now to Perez with more details about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine fallout. Perez.
Brandis, a major hiccup today for one of the main COVID-19 vaccines. Out of abundance of caution, Illinois state health officials ordered all coronavirus vaccine providers to pause the administering of Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. This comes as federal officials review data involving 6 women who got a rare and severe type of blood clot after the one-dose vaccine. Earlier today, Chicago's public health commissioner spoke about the news.
With fewer than 50,000 people having gotten the J&J vaccine, and at this point the rate of this severe side effect that we're seeing is about 1 in a million, I would would not statistically necessarily expect anybody in Chicago to have one of these events, but it isn't impossible.
And joining us to discuss this further is Dr. Emily Landon, Executive Medical Director for Infection Prevention and Control at UChicago Medicine. Dr. Landon, thanks for joining us again. So what do we know about these 6 reported blood clot cases tied to the J&J vaccine?
Yeah, so these women had a blood clot in the blood supply in the brain. Pretty significant. Symptoms are very similar to a stroke. These aren't the sort of blood clots that we see sometimes in women of the same age group where they get a blood clot in their leg or in their lung or something like that. These are a lot more serious, and they are related to a low level of blood platelets. And that suggests that there's an immune response against the platelets, which creates this kind of blood clot.
And for those that just received the Johnson & Johnson shot, I mean, you heard it's 1 in a million cases you're seeing here, but what would you advise those who might be worried right now?
First of all, you're more likely to get struck by lightning than you are to have this reaction to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's literally 1 in a million, and everyone except for one was successfully treated. And so the first thing to do is to take a deep breath and do not panic. All of the cases happened within about 15 or 16 days of the shot being given, and they're still working out, trying to figure out who's exactly at the highest risk, which group is sort of going to be the most risk, and they're casting a very wide net. And so for right now, if you got Johnson & Johnson vaccine, if you have any symptoms of sort of numbness, tingling, stroke-like symptoms, or any trouble breathing, anything concerning, please call your doctor. They're going to be able to talk you through it and work with you. Chances are great, as Dr. Arwady said, that no one that we know or no one in Illinois is going to have any of these side effects. Again, 1 in a million is so small. That should give everyone confidence in how incredibly careful our FDA and our CDC are in terms of watching what's happening with these vaccines.
And speaking of that, right, Dr. Fauci addressed that earlier today. Let's take a listen.
There have been now 120 million people that have received at least 1 dose of a vaccine. Most of that, subtract the 6.85 million, is in the messenger RNA from Pfizer and from Moderna. There have been no red flag signals from those. So you're talking about tens and tens and tens of millions of people who've received vaccine with no adverse effect. This is a really rare event.
A very rare event, Dr. Landon. Why then, with only 6 cases out of 7 million, the pause here?
Abundance of caution and making sure that we can keep everyone's confidence in vaccines. To put this in perspective, there are tons of drugs on the market. Many people watching, I take a medication that has a serious side effect that happens much more frequently than 1 in a million, and I need that medicine for another problem in my life, and so I take that medicine. There are millions of people out there taking medicines like that that don't ever worry about having that kind of problem. And so, but when it comes to a vaccine that's supposed to prevent something, it's best to know exactly what's going on before we, take a pause, look at the data, make sure we have all the information. And then I expect that we're going to see a more limited indication as they're going through the data. They'll say, for this group of people, we are certain that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is safe, and so they can go on receiving it. Everyone else should probably get Moderna and Pfizer. That's probably what's going to happen next. And I think the best thing I can say is just please remember that this is incredibly low risk. It's not even clear that it's connected yet.
Dr. Landon, what does this mean for Chicago's vaccine availability and Cook counties in the state of Illinois?
Yeah, that would be a great question for Dr. Arwady. It's going to set us back. We are definitely, there are a lot of places that are giving Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Johnson & Johnson is the fastest way to end up immune to COVID, which is really important right now since we have sort of a wave of infections coming our way from above us and, from north of us and from inside our own city. But I think the most important thing that we can do now is just get on the list to get a vaccine, get whatever vaccine you're able to get currently. Once Johnson & Johnson is back to providing the vaccine to whomever is at an appropriate risk level, please continue to trust. We are being extra careful and super careful.
Do you believe the Johnson & Johnson vaccine will eventually come back online in Chicago and around the country?
Yeah, absolutely. This vaccine is incredibly safe, with only 1 in a million people potentially having a reaction that may be related to the vaccine and seems to be in a specific age group of a specific group of individuals that we can take them out of the pool to get Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Once we can establish.
So are you saying women, women between like 18 and 48, that's the pool there?
We would call that women of childbearing age. So anyone, that's an age group where they're more likely to have autoimmune disease, more likely to have blood clotting, and that seems to be the same age group that we're seeing these particular clots. Now, others can get the clots, and they're going to have to search through all the people that have gotten this vaccine to make sure that there aren't other age groups at risk. But like the AstraZeneca vaccine in Europe is now approved only for people over the age of 50 because no one over the age of 50, or maybe it's 60 there, has ever had a bad reaction to it, and it works very well.
All right, Dr. Emily Landon, thanks for joining us as always.
Thank you.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Perez, thank you. Some community organizers are calling for the city to reopen mental health clinics. In 2012, Mayor Rahm Emanuel's administration closed half of the city's clinics. Mayor Lori Lightfoot campaigned on reopening the centers, but has focused her tenure so far on investing in organizations that provide mental health care. This fall, the city announced 32 organizations on Chicago's south and west sides would receive $8 million to expand services. Joining us to discuss calls for the clinics to be reopened and the city's mental health initiatives are Diana Castaneda, Director of Youth and Crisis Services at Community Counseling Centers of Chicago, which is among the organizations receiving funding from the city. Arturo Carrillo, a licensed clinical social worker and leader of Collaborative for Community Wellness, a group working to address access to mental health care in Chicago. Matt Richards, Deputy Commissioner of Behavioral Health at the Chicago Department of Public Health. And Amika Tendaji, Director of Black Lives Matter Chicago. She's organized around reopening the mental health clinics with Stop Chicago. Welcome all of you to Chicago tonight. So earlier today, we spoke with Woodlawn resident Horace Washington Howard about how the clinic closure impacted his mental health services. He says he used to live just blocks away from the Woodlawn Mental Health Clinic before it closed. Let's listen.
The closing of the Woodlawn Clinic impacted me very much so. At that time, it took almost 3 to 6 months to even get a therapist. And now I was traveling by L and bus to Lawrence, which is 40-some hundred north.
Arturo Carrillo, remind us what impact the closure has had on residents in the communities they served.
Yeah, it's already exacerbated a big problem in the city of Chicago. We've seen through recent research that there's an overwhelming demand for mental health services, and there's just not enough clinicians in low-income communities of color. What we see the disparity actually is a ratio that we've seen where 22% of the city's residents living in the most affluent neighborhoods have an access of 4.5 therapists per 1,000 community residents, whereas low-income communities of color, low-income communities in general, have an access ratio of 0.2 therapists per 1,000 community residents. And so that's an enormous disparity we're talking about.
Matt Richards, the mayor announced in the fall, as we mentioned earlier, just over $9 million being allocated to 32 organizations on the city's south and west sides. Tell us about how that program is working to help those most in need of mental health services.
Thank you, Brandis. Yeah, the mayor's strategy has involved tripling the city's mental health budget in her first 2 years in office. So it's been a really significant investment, and we've been very focused on expanding care to service providers who provide care regardless of ability to pay, health insurance status, or immigration status, We made that $8 million investment in 34 community areas, primarily on the south and west side. All those services are up and running. They have been since October 1st of last year. We've integrated mental health professionals, or about to, across the city's 911 system for the first time. We're funding team-based care because not all patients, especially patients with more complex needs, may benefit from having folks come to them rather than them needing to come into a clinic. We've incorporated mental health services across the city's entire homeless shelter system. So we've been incredibly busy because we've tripled that budget. There's no doubt we have more work to do, but we're really committed to continuing to do it.
Amika Tendaji, of course, you're among the folks who are calling on the city to reopen those clinics. Why is this important when the city says that it is making investments in mental health through other avenues?
It's critical that we reopen the public mental health clinics because the private sector is not accountable. Pre-pandemic last year, we had Alderman and a team call the sites that the city said were available. Many were not. Many didn't answer the phone or respond in any way. We need public clinics so that we can hold someone accountable. In addition, it's Chicago with gentrification and police brutality that's causing and exacerbating mental health issues for its city. So it should take responsibility for healing Chicagoans.
Diana Castaneda, your organization C4 is among those receiving the funds of the city's investment. How has that impacted the work that you're able to do?
Yeah, it's impacted us in a variety of ways. I'll name two very briefly. One is it really helps us in the fight for equity. We've been seeing these issues for a long time. And so with the money that the city has allotted through these grants, we're working exclusively with 5 neighborhoods on the west side. So right now, anybody can call us and get services right away. The second way is that it's really focused on prevention services instead of crisis services. So we have a long history of doing crisis work well, but we're tired of only dealing with crises. We want to help people heal from the beginning. We want to help them get access right away. And so part of us allocating, because of the money the city gave us, allocating our resources has gone directly straight to 5 West Side neighborhoods, where again, they can call and get services right away, whether that's crisis, whether that's prevention, whether that's trauma and healing, whatever they need.
And Arturo, you've been conducting research related to access to mental health resources in the city. Is the need being met?
Absolutely not. This is laughable. I mean, we're talking $8 million. Let's put this into perspective. I'll invite your viewers to divide $8 million by 1.7 billion. Wait, that's the amount of money that the city is putting towards policing. We're talking about half a penny to every dollar that goes to policing is being invested in the city acting as a philanthropist. What we need is the city to take ownership of the problem, to reopen the clinics, to make those clinics the essential safety net for community residents from all parts of the city. What we found is even after this initiative has been implemented, we found that 86% of residents in a recent citywide survey said that they do not have enough mental health services in their community. Right, adding a few $100,000 to organizations does not increase the access to care where we have such desperate need for services in different parts of the city.
Matt Richards, I want to give you the opportunity to respond to that.
I think our focus is really about strengthening the system that provides care regardless of ability to pay, health insurance status, or immigration status, right? That's over 200 health centers in the city of Chicago that are regulated by the federal government. It's community mental health centers that are accredited by the state. 5 of those over 200 are clinics that are operated by the city. We value those clinics. We've invested millions since the mayor has taken office. We've actually fundamentally transformed 4 of the 5 sites that needed a lot of additional investment. So it's not city services versus the broader system. It's both. And that's what we've done from the beginning, is investing in our own clinics, but then also recognizing that folks get their care in a lot of different places. And it's important for us to invest in those locations as well.
Diana, are you able to give a specific example of how the city's investment in C4 has been able to help you all provide additional services or increase capacity?
Yeah, and so really, as it's been talked about already, there's a huge workforce issue. And so what it's really allowed us to do is to take clinicians and have them dedicate their time and their energy to building relationships with schools, with the communities that we've been given the money to serve in kind of this equity thing. So certainly there's such high need in the city, and not resources can't go everywhere. What the money from the city is helping is that we're allocating the resources to the people who have often been harmed by things like institutional racism, by things like police brutality, violence, disinvestment in their neighborhoods. Our strategy is to focus directly more on those communities that have been traumatized in that way. Understanding we can't serve everyone, we're making choices to serve those that have been historically disenfranchised.
And Amika, what have you heard from the residents that you're organizing with about access to mental health resources in the communities where the clinics were closed?
Oh, there's not nearly enough, and folks really, we need to really recognize the need for public and accountable mental health clinics, right? To make sure things can shift from completely free of care to there's a charge if it's private, and our folks are really dedicated to it has to be public mental health clinics everywhere, access to quality clinicians everywhere for everyone.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it for now. Obviously an important issue for a lot of people. My thanks to Diana Castaneda, Arturo Carrillo, Matt Richards, and Amika Tindaji for joining us.
Thank you.
And now to Phil Ponce and weighing changes to the country's highest court. Phil.
Branda's President Joe Biden announces that a bipartisan commission will spend 6 months studying possible changes to the Supreme Court. What kind of changes are on the table? Adding more seats to the court and instituting term limits for justices, among other things. Joining us now to talk about his own research on the topic is Adam Chilton. He's a professor and the Walter Mander Research Scholar at the University of Chicago Law School. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, the Constitution says that the Congress can determine the number of justices, and there have not always been 9 justices. Tell us more about that.
That's correct. So the Constitution doesn't mention the number of justices on the Supreme Court. Initially, the first Congress set the number at 6 justices. And over the course of the 17 and 1800s, that number moved up and down, I think about 7 times. In 1869, the number settled in on 9 justices, and it's been that way ever since.
So 9 justices since 1869. Another, and we'll get to the prospect of increasing the size in a minute, but another option that's on the table is term limits for justices, and the most frequently mentioned potential term is an 18-year term. Is that a good idea?
Yes, I think it's a great idea, in that with an 18-year term, it ensures that every president that's elected would be able to appoint 2 justices. So one in their first 2 years and one in their second 2 years. And that would have the nice effect of more closely linking the composition of the Supreme Court to electoral outcomes. Whereas now it's determined by the vagaries of when the justices die or when they strategically retire. So you have situations where Jimmy Carter was able to appoint 0 Supreme Court justices during his 4-year term, but Donald Trump, during his 3-year term, was able to appoint 3. And so right now we have a system that's really determined a lot by random luck and strategic behavior, and the term limits would help to even the appointments across presidential terms.
And you've done research on this. You ran some models and so forth. What did that research tell you? And you touched on it slightly, but what did the research tell you about what term limits of 18 years would do to the liberal conservative breakdown on the court?
So one impact is that it would be the balance of the Supreme Court would be less likely to be extremely partisan. That is, it would be less likely that you'd have years in which there were 7 or 8 justices appointed by presidents from the same party. And the reason is that our presidential elections tend to go back and forth. So we had Biden, before that was Trump, before that Obama, Bush, et cetera, between Democrats and Republicans. And if you have term limits, it basically then ensures that the court more closely reflects those electoral outcomes. So you'd have a lot more years with 5 or 6 justices from the same party composing the majority, instead of 7 or 8 justices from the same party composing the majority.
My understanding is that term limits have a more seem to have more support among both liberals and conservatives than adding seats to the court. Why is that?
Well, I think that having term limits is a system where it seems stable long-term and also fair. if we were to add seats now, it would create a windfall for the party that's able to add those seats. And the natural response then would be in the future, when there's a Republican president and a Republican Senate, that they would be tempted to add seats as well. And the worry would be that you just have a tit-for-tat response until the Supreme Court grew larger and larger. But with
No, what I was going to say is my understanding is that you and a lot of other people think that the prospect of adding seats to the court is pretty much dead in the water. Is that how you feel?
I think that's right. With the Democrats only having 51 votes in the Senate and currently the unwillingness to get rid of the filibuster, the prospect of adding more seats to the Supreme Court, I think, is completely unlikely in the current situation.
Going back to the prospect of term limits, how would that work? Could it be done by statute? Would it have to be done via constitutional amendment? What do you think?
So this is hotly debated. What the Constitution says is that the justices of the Supreme Court shall serve in a term of good behavior. Now, good behavior has been interpreted to mean that the justices can't be removed unless they commit some form of impeachable offense. And so any term limit plan that would want to get rid of the current justices or to put a hard cap on the amount of time you can be a Supreme Court justice on 18 years would require a constitutional amendment. However, a number of the plans instead call for the idea that after 18 years on the court, that the justices would still be Supreme Court justices, but they would transition to senior status where they had different responsibilities. So they might be able to participate in some internal deliberations or the management of the federal judiciary, or sit on lower court cases, but they wouldn't be deciding the merits cases in front of the Supreme Court. Now, if the term limits plan takes that approach, then it's possible it could just be done by a statute passed by Congress.
If it were done via statute, would presumably that someone would challenge the statute, and could it ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court itself?
Yes, that's right. Ultimately, whether or not the term limits was consistent with Article 3 of the Constitution, which sets out the rules for the judiciary, is a constitutional question, and that's a question that the Supreme Court would have the authority to determine. So you not only have to convince the senators and Congress people to pass a term limits plan, you would have to convince John Roberts and the other members of the Supreme Court that it was constitutional as well. And that might be tricky, since they would be essentially signing away their right to a lifetime appointment of having a position of huge influence.
And it's unlikely that any of them would recuse themselves on an issue that was so personal. Professor Chilton, thank you so much for joining us. We very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And now, Brandis, we go back to you.
Phil, thank you. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, a fine for breaking campaign finance rules reduced by thousands for Alderman Carrie Austin. We'll tell you why. The Justice Department moves to join a lawsuit that claims Chicago's failed to make crosswalks accessible for those who are blind or visually impaired. Some are calling for $50,000 in student loan forgiveness. What kind of impact could canceling student debt loan or loan debt have on the economy and taxation? And after 6 decades of keeping Chicago spicy, La Croyola Foods is poised for growth with the city's Latino community. But first, some more of today's top stories. Kenosha police officer Rustin Chesky will not face any charges for the August shooting of Jacob Blake, another police shooting that sparked controversy and protests last summer. In a statement, the Kenosha police chief says the incident was investigated by an outside agency, reviewed by an independent expert and the county district attorney, and that Chesky was found to have been acting within policy. Blake was shot 7 times in the back and left paralyzed by the incident. Chesky returned from administrative leave last month. New mothers in Illinois who receive Medicaid benefits while pregnant can continue on Medicaid for a full year after delivering their babies. The governor announced the Medicaid extension today, making Illinois the first in the country to extend coverage from 60 days postpartum to 12 months. Research has shown that in Illinois, Black women are 6 times more likely to die of a pregnancy-related condition than white women, and that 70% of those deaths could have been prevented. And now to Perez with details about a significant drop in fines for one alderman. Perez.
Thanks, Brandis. 34th Ward Alderman Carrie Austin will have to pay $5,000 in fines for violating campaign contribution rules. That might sound like a lot, but maybe not after hearing the original fine that she owed. It was $145,000. WTTW News reporter Heather Sharon joins us now with more. Heather, first of all, remind us what Alderman Austin was charged with by the Ethics Department and why that fine has gone down $140,000.
Well, the city has rules on the books that basically says that if you're a company or an individual that has a city contract, you're limited to giving the mayor, alderman, city treasurer, and city clerk only $1,600. That's it for the whole year. Alderman Austin accepted $48,000 from Benchmark Construction Company over 2 years in 2017 and 2019, blowing those limits. And the ethics board hit her in January with the maximum allowed, which is 3 times the amount of the improper campaign contribution. But on Monday, the board met and decided that that was a little bit too tough given the equities of the situation. They said they would fine her just $5,000. The same amount they hit the company with that made the improper contributions to begin with.
So the board rethinking that initial fine. And Heather, Alderman Austin also, we remember in 2019 her office was raided by the feds. What's the latest with that federal investigation or apparent investigation?
Yeah, wouldn't we like to know? The alderman, who is the second longest serving alderman on the city council, has not been charged, and she denies wrongdoing. And this is what's been happening at City Hall for years now. We know that there are federal investigations going on, but we don't know what status they're in or whether they're still active. So we will just have to wait and see if something else pops up in regards to Alderman Austin, who used to be the chair of the Budget Committee, but was ousted by Mayor Lori Lightfoot.
Heather, I remember roaming around City Hall and every alderman worried who might be wearing a wire on another alderman. Crazy times indeed. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, Perez.
And now, Brandis, back to you.
Perez, late last week, the Justice Department moved to join a lawsuit against the city of Chicago that alleges it's failed to make crosswalks accessible to people who are blind, deafblind, or have low vision. The DOJ says the city is required to install accessible pedestrian signals that give audio or tactile cues that it's safe to cross the street. But according to the suit, Chicago has just 15 of those at its 2,700 intersections with visual crosswalk signals. Joining us to discuss the suit are Julie Tai, President and CEO of the Hadley Institute for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and Randall Schmidt, Clinical Professor of Law at the University of Chicago and the Director at the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic. We invited the city to join us tonight, but they declined. In a statement, the law department says, quote, while the city denies any violation of federal law, it does not oppose this intervention and looks forward to working with the DOJ to build upon the commitments and foundation it has already made in this area. Julie and Randy, thanks to both of you for joining us. So, Julie, what's the scale here in terms of people affected? How many people are affected by blindness and low vision?
So, Brandis, it is primarily older adults who are impacted as a result of age-related eye disease, so macular degeneration, glaucoma, diabetic retinopathy. 10,000 people turn 65 every day. So the incidence of visual impairment, that is being legally blind, is increasing rapidly. And so I think an easy way to imagine it is that for every 3 older adults that in your life or on the street, 1 is likely to be legally blind.
Okay. Randy, what are state and local governments required to provide as far as accessibility?
Well, both the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disability Act from the 1990s require state and local governments to provide, in essence, that people with disabilities be treated equally. And in this context, what the law is being interpreted as requiring is equal access to information. So at these crosswalks, the walk, don't walk signs that we see are providing us with information, and people who are visually impaired are not having equal access to that information.
Julie, what kinds of crosswalks can cities install for people who have vision issues or are deafblind?
So there are different types. So for people who are visually impaired, there are audible signals. There are also chirps and talking messages. So you can actually say, you cannot cross right now between, Green Bay Road and Elm Street. So those are possible. And for the deaf-blind community, emerging technology for vibro-tactile surfaces, so an actual ability to feel when it is safe to cross.
Randy, what could a lawsuit like this achieve?
Well, most importantly, it can achieve injunctive relief that requires an order requiring the city to install some type of device so that people who are visually impaired know when it's safe to cross these intersections. As you mentioned, there are only 15 of these out of 2,700 intersections that the city has deemed require that type of information to be provided to sighted people, but not to people who are visually impaired. So that's the most important relief. There's also the possibility of compensatory damages if the plaintiffs show that the city acted with, in essence, a deliberate indifference or intentionally is discriminating against those individuals.
Julie, is it possible that, some people, fellow pedestrians maybe, are not quite aware of just how many people are affected by blindness or low vision problems? Not everyone uses a service dog or walks with a cane.
Brandis, that's a really important point. It is largely an invisible disability. So obviously, if you see somebody with a white cane or a dog, that's a signal that they're visually impaired. But for low vision, for legal blindness, but with some degree of vision, you are not likely to know that the person next to you is struggling to see whether or not they can cross the street.
Randy, how difficult can a discrimination case be to prove in this instance?
Well, discrimination cases in general are always very difficult to prove. In this case, there are two things that suggest to me that the plaintiffs have a fairly decent case. First, just the sheer numbers, 15 out of 2,700. The city needs to explain why. They've known since 2006 they need to increase this, yet there are only 15 intersections that are protected. And secondly, the Department of Justice decision to intervene in this case. The Department of Justice did this after an investigation into this, and its investigation, the DOJ concluded that the city was violating these two acts, and so they are seeking to intervene.
Julie, are you hopeful that, accessible pedestrian signals will become commonplace in Chicago and other cities?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful. I believe the city of Chicago cares about its citizens and wants to do the right thing. It's complex cities have lots of priorities. I think the Department of Justice's intervention is going to make this a higher priority. And I have to wonder if it really isn't sending a signal to other cities across the country that this is important. And it gives Chicago an opportunity to be a model city for other cities.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. Julie Ty and Randall Schmidt, thanks for joining us. I'm sure the two of you will keep watching, keep an eye on this case.
Thank you.
Good night.
Up next, the debate over canceling student debt. But first, a look at the weather.
More than $1.7 trillion. That's how much total student debt that Americans owe. Now there are new calls for President Biden to cancel up to $50,000 or more of loan debt per student. But critics say it would put an undue burden on Americans that never went to college. And joining us are Cody Hunanian, Program Director of the California-based advocacy organization Student Debt Crisis, and Brad Palumbo, policy consultant for the libertarian think tank Foundation for Economic Education based in Washington, D.C. Thank you both of us for joining us. Cody, I'll start with you. Your basic case for canceling some level of student debt.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me today. This issue has become, I think, one of the top priorities for Americans across the country, and I'm happy to echo their voices. Debt cancellation is a top priority for many reasons, but during the pandemic, first and foremost, we need a stimulus. We need something that can be immediately done to boost the economy, and we know that the president has the authority to cancel student debt immediately with executive action, and by doing so, it would add over $100 billion to the economy and add jobs to the economy. We need that now during the pandemic.
Brad, you've written in the National Review that you think that something like this would amount to a, quote, regressive tax. Explain how you think that is.
Yeah, so that's not my opinion. That's the finding of a University of Chicago study that found that student debt cancellation would give 6 times more benefit to the top 20% of income earners than it would to the bottom 20% of income earners. So student debt cancellation is often talked about as a progressive proposal, but it's actually a thinly veiled taxpayer-funded bailout for wealthy, educated, and relatively well-off people. Only about 1 in 3 adults over age 25 went to college. But when you force taxpayers to pay off their student debt, that includes the other two-thirds of adults who never went to college. So you're redistributing resources to a relatively well-off slice of society.
Cody Hunanian, what about that argument that it's regressive in that it affects higher earners because they're the ones that tend to have college degrees or advanced degrees and thus student debt?
Well, I think that research is pretty flawed, and I say that because for every person who never had to take out student loans because they are wealthy, because they are in positions of privilege, they're not well represented in this data. When we look at the population of who has student loan debt, yes, there is a significant portion that's white and has a higher income, but there's also the many communities of color impacted by predatory for-profit colleges, all the people who could not complete and have poor job prospects. We know that debt cancellation is something that would be beneficial for those communities as well. And let's not forget that debt cancellation helps our entire economy. And we know polls recently have showed that a majority of voters, even those who never had student loans, even those who paid back their student loans, support canceling student loan debt because they just know it's wrong. It's fundamentally immoral that our system crushes students with debt.
Brad Palumbo, what about that? Hundreds of thousands of students out there that do have some level of debt, and perhaps it does strangle their own personal finances. Would there not be some kind of economic stimulus to canceling some level of student debt?
No, there wouldn't be, and that's because debt is paid back over decades. So spending 1.5 or more trillion in dollars right now to create 100 billion in economic growth is not a good trade-off. Every dollar spent somewhere has to be taken from somewhere else. The government can't create money out of thin air. Well, they can create money, but not resources. And so even the nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget found that student debt relief is not effective economic stimulus. So when we're talking about this issue as a form of economic stimulus, we're totally missing the plot. That's 1.5 trillion that could come from somewhere else.
Cody Hunanian, the president campaigned on $10,000 of student debt cancellation. Democrats now are calling for $50,000. Is there a difference in the level here? Is there a level that you prefer?
Yeah, as an organization that represents over 2 million Americans impacted by student loan debt, we are fighting for broad-based debt cancellation. That means the most amount of relief for the most amount of people. But of the proposals on the table, $50,000 is the one that we are standing by, and over 1 million of our supporters are standing by through petition signatures and actions. And that is because that would provide debt relief for over 80% of people with student loan debt, completely erase it. But, I have to go back to Brad's point about spending $1 trillion on $100 billion in stimulus. That's just not correct. The money spent on student loans is already out the door. What we're talking about is not receiving payments on student loans.
But taxpayers have to pay off the money.
It would take several decades for that to reach over $1 trillion.
And we should mention that not a lot of federal government spending these days is accounted for. It's just debt and the Fed printing more money. But go ahead.
Both of those things have real economic costs.
No doubt about it.
Yeah, and I just think the idea that canceling student loan debt means that the government is literally paying off people's loans as if they're writing a check to a bank. That's not how it works. That's a misunderstanding of the system. And I think it's a really important detail to point out.
Brad Palumbo, do you personally have student debt? And despite the economic numbers that you mentioned, do you sympathize with people that might be over their head in debt?
Look, there are some people that I sympathize with in odd examples, but by and large, I mean, the idea that this is a crisis is overblown. The median monthly student loan payment is between $200 and $300. If you aren't able to pay that with a college degree, it's because you made a mistake somewhere along the line. Maybe you chose to study French poetry or gender studies instead of accounting or business or STEM. But you know what? That's your decision. And passing on the consequences of that decision to other people is what's fundamentally immoral. I do not have student debt because I chose an affordable college, graduated a year early, and worked nights from my first day on campus as a security guard to avoid that debt. And to take other people's debt and other people's decisions who maybe chose to go to an expensive private school and take 5 years to graduate, well, to make me pay for that, that is what is fundamentally immoral.
All right, Cody, I want you to respond to that. I mean, is it partially the responsibility of the individual that took out that debt and the choices that they made?
Absolutely. People who borrow to pay for college, they know the responsibility they're taking on. But as someone who actually has student loan debt, went to a public university, and worked my way through college, I lived this experience, and I also talk to borrowers every single day. And the reality is that paying back this debt is extremely problematic when you talk about compounding interest. You talk about a broken student loan system. You talk about for-profit predatory colleges and student loan servicing companies that today we're on the Hill getting grilled by senators on both sides of the aisle. I'm quoting a GOP senator today who said, if our best and brightest can't get it, then something's wrong. That is the reality of the system today. That is why it's a crisis. And it's not just about monthly payments. It's about not being able to purchase a home, start a family, or start a business.
We know this debate is going to go on, but we have to leave it there for now. Our thanks to Cody Hunanian and Brad Palumbo. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks
for having us.
And when Avelino Maldonado started his spice distribution company La Criolla in Chicago in 1957, the biggest waves of Latino immigrants had yet to arrive. 64 years later, Latinos make up nearly 30% of the city's population, and La Criolla has new owners who hope to bring their flavors to another generation of cooks. Chicago Tonight producer Erica Gunderson has this story.
I was born and raised in Chicago. So my mother used to use La Criolla brand. So I feel like it's a legacy in that part because we're bringing it on to our children and, our grandchildren.
As in so many cultures, for Latinos, the family kitchen is a sacred place where traditions are passed down from generation to generation. And since 1957, when Avelino Maldonado started La Criolla Foods by selling spice blends out of the trunk of his car, the company has offered a taste of home for Chicago's Latino families.
We have the sazon and the adobo. That was a creation from Avelino. That is like a multi-seasoning. You can put everything.
Maria and Jose Chaparro took over La Criolla Foods at its original location in the West Loop in 2016. They bought the company from founder Avelino Maldonado's wife, Carmen.
Carmen was looking for pass the legacy, Latino family, so we was the lucky ones to get it.
In 2018, the Chaparros moved La Criolla to a larger facility in South suburban Alsip. Since then, they've been working on plans to expand and promote their brand to a new generation via social media. La Criolla's finance and operations manager, Raul Rosas, says the pandemic has renewed interest in cooking at home.
It's been a resurgence of having to experiment again with your cooking and having to remember those recipes that your mom has made, or had to get on a Zoom call or Google Meet call with them or FaceTime to say, hey, am I doing this correctly? Am I picking the right spices? Am I adding the right pinch? Because it's always a pinch.
And getting just the right flavor to spark that memory of home cooking is La Criolla's mission.
what we hope is when they open it, they'll smell home and remember their mother, their grandmother cooking, whatever it may be. For me, it's the carne molida en chile verde that my mom makes.
Executive Chef Roberto Perez is in charge of bringing those flavors to life via recipes and photos on social media.
What that means right now is that I'm doing some food testing, some testing with some spices, testing them out, checking them out in different particular recipes and seeing if any adjustments need to be made. So a lot of the ingredients are inspired from Caribbean cooking.
As part of extending their brand's reach, Rosa says another big move for La Criolla is in the works.
Which is what we're doing in our plans for this near future, is positioning it for an equity crowdfunding campaign where the community is able to invest and be part of the growth of La Criolla.
People know La Criolla is the local brand of Chicago.
And as the city's Latino population grows, Rosa says the company is positioned to grow along with it.
The Latino market is a market that's, I think it's been overlooked for quite some time. It's a sleeping giant, and it's a powerful, there's power in your household as a Latino household.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Erica Gunderson.
For more on La Criolla, be sure to check out our website. And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7.
Now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Perez Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks so much for watching. Stay safe and healthy, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud of its partners named Illinois leading lawyers by the Law Bulletin Publishing Company of Chicago.